Hi guys, thank you for joining me while we talk about parables today. So, today we're going to talk about the parable of the old wineskin with the new wine. So before we get started though, let's do highs and lows, and we'll also do prayers and blessings at the end. So I encourage you to do highs and lows and prayers and blessings with everybody you shelter in place with, or if you're alone with friends, it's a wonderful way to stay connected to people. So my high is that it was very sunny out yesterday. I enjoyed it very much. Got to go out and do a little yard work. And my low is just concern for the people in Wisconsin who are vulnerable or who are scared with the new overturned law by overturned ruling by the Supreme Court. So that is my concern. So let's talk about wine. So I'm going to read out of Luke chapter 5. I'm going to do verse 33 and then go to verse 36 through 39. And I'm going to read out of the Children's International Version because the language is a little bit more family friendly. They said to Jesus, "John's followers often give up eating and pray just as the Pharisees do. But your followers eat and drink all the time." Jesus told them this story. No one takes cloth off of a new coat to cover a hole in an old coat. If he does, he ruins the new coat, and it will not be the same as the old cloth. People never pour new wine into old leather bags for holding wine. If they do, the new wine will break out of the bags, and the wine will spill out. Then the leather bags for holding the wine will be ruined. People always put new wine into new leather bags. No one, after drinking old wine, wants new wine because he says the old wine is better. So let's talk about this a little bit. So first of all, let's talk about the question that they asked Jesus. The people were very curious and suspicious because the Pharisees, they would fast, meaning not eat, and they would pray at, certain holidays and maybe even a couple times a week. And John the Baptist followers did the same thing. But Jesus' followers never did that. And it seemed very strange to them. Kind of like that last line where it says, no one after drinking old wine wants new wine because he says the old wine is better. They're used to this. This is comforting to them, this older way of doing things. But Jesus is coming through with a whole new way of doing things, and it makes people a little bit uncomfortable. Now, the other thing I want to explain is how wine works, because it's one way to understand the story. The people back then, they understood how wine fermented and what the leather bags were about and so on and so forth. It was pretty commonplace to them. But we do it differently now. So nowadays, when we talk about wine, talk about a bottle of wine. Okay, it's a glass bottle. There's no leather involved. And even if we do imagine a leather bag for holding wine, in our imagination, it's about the same size as this. But back then, they would ferment wine. They would start by smashing the grapes, and they would do a first fermentation. And then they'd get rid of all the yeast and the solids and the yucky stuff. And then they would do a second fermentation in a leather bag. But this leather bag was big. It was the size of a goat. In fact, it was an entire goat skin. So they would take an entire goat skin with the legs cut off, sewn up, and the tail sewn up, and so on and so forth, and put all the new wine in there. And the wine would continue to ferment. So when it ferments, it lets a lot of air out. So this bag would stretch and stretch and stretch and stretch and stretch until it was almost to the point of bursting. Now, eventually the wine would be done fermenting and they could pour it out and drink it. But the new wine was always a little bitter. Wine that has aged a little bit tends to taste a little bit better. Now, Jesus then tells this story, and he says, you wouldn't take new wine and put it into an old wineskin. Well, now we know that's because it would burst, because as the air was released, you'd have this old, weak wineskin that would really burst badly. And you'd waste all the wine, and you'd never be able to use your leather bag again either. And he says you wouldn't take an old coat and patch it with a new coat. You wouldn't cut up a new coat to do a patch. Well, this makes sense to us. We wear coats. We get that. What Jesus is actually talking about is the Old Testament way of doing things and the New Testament way of doing things. So in the Old Testament, there were a lot of laws, a lot of rules, a lot of things you had to follow. And if you did anything wrong or sinned in any way, you would sacrifice an animal or make a sacrifice to atone for these sins, to pay for these sins. Well, Jesus, you see, he was still alive at this point, but he knew he was going to die. And he knew he was going to pay for our sins and then rise again. Well, once Jesus paid for our sins, all of those sins are forgiven. We don't have to worry about just following the letter of the law. In fact, all through the time that Jesus had his ministry and was preaching, he was telling people it's more important to love God, to have a relationship with God, to live out your faith through your heart. That's a pretty cool thing. And this is the new way of doing things. At least in this story, this is what he's referring to when he says the new way. It is loving God with all your heart and being forgiven so that we don't have to worry about following every single little law the way they had to back then. So that's what Jesus means. You're not going to mix the old way of doing things and the new way of doing things. There's a whole new way. Celebrate it and enjoy it. So that's our parable. I hope you enjoyed it. Let's end with prayer and blessings. Dear God, I pray that everybody who is watching this is staying safe right now. I pray for all the people in Wisconsin who are scared or nervous or upset or vulnerable. I pray that you protect them, keep them safe, and continue to give them comfort. Blessings to you. Kids, bless your parents. Parents, bless your kids. I will see you later.